Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Lesson 32, we're calling this one Loaves and Fish, and we're going to primarily lean on John's Gospel, although it's interesting that all four Gospels record the feeding of the 5,000, and that is pretty rare when that happens. And when it does happen, we definitely want to take notice because it means there's something special going on with this episode in Jesus' ministry. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans who receive the word with all eagerness, but they examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. And by this teaching, enable us to be doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. So loaves and fish, the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, it's fascinating because it's mentioned in all four Gospels. So we'll look at some chronology of where we are in Jesus' timeline and where we are, which is the geography. And then we'll get into the narrative itself. Jesus is going to teach and heal and feed 5,000. Then we're going to see that the crowds want to crown him a political Messiah. And so he's going to dismiss them. Or if you read the Gospel of John, it almost reads like he has to evade the crowd to go and pray alone. What they're seeing and what we may miss is that they're seeing a parallel between Jesus and Moses. And there's just a lot of that going on that, of course, Moses was the original deliverer. And so they see that Jesus is the second Moses. So we've got all of this happening on Passover. We've got this retreat up to a mountain. We've got bread or manna coming from heaven. And then we're going to end with the calming of the sea, or conquering the sea, we might even say, with Jesus demonstrating that the limitations of physics don't even apply to him. Jesus can overcome those. And then what's fascinating is we're going to have Peter walking on water as well. And I always like to remember that the 11 other apostles didn't even get out of the boat, but Peter did. So Peter gets chastised for lack of faith, but I think the other 11 played it safe. And we have to always keep that in mind too. And then the passage ends with a miracle that a lot of people miss, but instead of being in the middle of the lake, Jesus immediately transports them into a harbor that's on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So we've got all kinds of laws of physics being broken here, and so this will be a fun chapter to dig into. Chronology-wise, we've mentioned that this is a transition lesson as he retreats from the area of Herod Antipas and crosses over into Bethsaida, which is in the territory of Herod Philip. So there's a geographic transition. There's also a content transition, because we're going to see that he's going to feed the 5,000 on a plain east of Bethsaida. That's box 6B. We don't know exactly where it is, but this is just a guess. Then he's going to walk on water, which you can see that mark there. And then he's going to give the bread of life discourse in beginning with John chapter 6, verse 22 and following. We'll look at next time. He's going to give that in the synagogue at Capernaum. But we're going to see that not a lot of crowds are following him after the end of this sermon, because he starts talking openly that his death is going to provide life for others. And so this is one characteristic of the new phase of Jesus' ministry, is not only that he tends to avoid the region of Herod Antipas, he doesn't exclusively do that, but one thing he does do is he starts talking openly about his death. And that is really a symbol leading all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, where he says, I must go to Jerusalem. And Peter says, may it never be. And the Lord issues those famous words, get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about here. And so we've got all of this kind of happening all at once, and we'll cover a lot of ground just in the next few lessons as Jesus begins to make his way towards the cross. All right, John chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias, which is sometimes called. Again, it's Luke 9 that tells us that Jesus was somewhere in the vicinity of Bethsaida. Again, we don't know exactly where. And even today, archaeologists think they may have discovered Bethsaida, but there's some problems with it, and it doesn't fit for a lot of reasons. It does appear to be an Old Testament city, which is kind of fascinating. We'll get into that on a different day. It is far from the shore, which is one problem you can see on the map, and so it's likely that a fishing town probably would have been a little bit closer to the shore. Nonetheless, we have the feeding of the 5,000 was probably some distance from wherever Bethsaida was in one of the fields there, and I'll have another picture of a possible location in a future slide. A large crowd was following him because they were watching the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. But Jesus went up the mountain and there sat with his disciples. We need to keep in mind the Moses-like comparisons here. So note, he went up the mountain just like Moses went up Mount Sinai. Here's another picture of the plain of Bethsaida, and we don't know exactly what hill he climbed, but it was probably one of these hills. And note the view that he has of the lake at this point. So he can also have a bird's eye view for what's going to happen towards the end of this lesson when the disciples are trapped in the storm there. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. This will be the second of 3 Passovers mentioned by John in his gospel. The first was when Jesus overturned the tables at the beginning of his ministry, and some scholars think that maybe that's the same episode as the other 3 gospels record at the end of his ministry. For whatever reason, John has his reasons for putting it at the front. And of course, the third Passover, the second is this one. The third one is going to be the day he's crucified. The Samaritans to this day continue to observe Passover, and they sacrifice a lamb every year on Mount Gerizim. So it's interesting that John does not record Jesus going to Jerusalem, but according to Exodus 23, Jesus would have been required to go to Jerusalem. So one thought is after all of this happened with the storm and the walking on water and then the sermon, then he ultimately did attend the feast in Jerusalem. We just don't know. Lancaster suggests that Jesus specifically chose this time, Passover, because he wanted to identify the feeding of the 5,000 with the breaking of bread with his Last Supper 12 months from now. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about the institution of the Lord's Supper at the Last Supper, but John does not mention this. And so one thought here is that John's bread of life discourse, which again we'll look at next time, that's going to be John's version of Jesus's instituting the sacrament of Holy Communion. So Jesus, after raising his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" But he was saying this only to test him, for he himself knew what he intended to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not enough for them, for each just to receive a little. So we'll get to Philip in a second, but first, we learn from the other Gospels, Jesus is trying to get some rest here, but compassion and ministry needs are going to interrupt his rest, and of course, he's going to answer that call. And so a question for us, are we willing to let ministry interrupt our planned quiet time and our vacations? When we want time away, sometimes we just need time away, but if duty calls, then Jesus was always willing to step up and to serve. And in fact, this feeding miracle about to unfold, it continues the imagery of a shepherd taking care and pasturing his sheep. Matthew 9:36, seeing the large crowd, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. And so again, he has compassion on this crowd here. He needed rest, but he probably spent the entire day healing and ministering to the people. Here's another Moses parallel. Jesus said to Philip, "From where are we to buy bread?" And there's lots of Moses parallels here. This one is from Numbers, where Moses said, "Where am I to give meat to give all this people? For they weep before me, saying, 'Give us meat so that we may eat.'" He said this to test him, and this test reminds me of, you may have heard the phrase, think outside the box. Well, that phrase comes from a puzzle. And so the original puzzle, you may or may not know this, but it was the challenge is to connect all 9 dots you see in this 3x3 grid using only 4 lines without lifting the pen. And people try some variation where at best they can only connect 8 dots with 4 lines. So they try and go around the outside, they go down the middle and over, and you can only get at most 8 dots if you're only using straight lines. But the puzzle is easily solved once we realize we can extend the lines beyond the boundaries of the grid. So you can see it goes off to the left, and then it goes below to solve the puzzle in 4 lines. And so the point of this puzzle and the subsequent phrase, think outside the box, is that we often enter into situations and we self-impose limitations. There's no rule that said you can't extend past the edge of the dot, right? That's we see that and we impose a barrier that isn't there, and no one ever said we couldn't do that. And so our message here is how often, like Philip, do we approach life's situations as if Jesus isn't there? Because without Jesus, this puzzle that Philip has to solve is impossible. But with Jesus, all things are possible. And I think it's fascinating because our walking in his dust verse says, James 1:6, he must ask in faith without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. I find that fascinating, given the saga that we're about to encounter and the previous calming of the storm. So in the same way as Philip, we can't be too hard on Philip because it's a picture of us. We will always be confronted with problems that are too big for us to solve. But we have to remember these problems aren't too big for Jesus. The disciples on multiple occasions, as Philip does here, forget who is standing right there with him, and we do exactly the same thing. There's another interesting twist here. Some scholars believe that 200 denarii may have represented the entirety of their assets. That's about 8 months' wages. So it's not a small sum, but not enough to feed this large crowd. And I think the challenge then for us is how often do we measure what is and what is not possible through a financial lens? Well, we don't have enough money to do this. But again, we forget that God is right there with us and he's in charge of all things. There was a quote from a commentary: how many times do we have to see God work before we stop doubting? And the author writes, I don't know. I certainly haven't reached that point. When I face a situation that seems impossible, I look for human solutions, as Philip did. And if I don't see any, then I despair, as Andrew did. And we'll see that in the next verse. Thinking, what good will it do? What difference will it make? So let's look at now Andrew's dilemma here as well. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, all of these people are from Bethsaida, by the way, which is, there's a geographic connection here. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people? This is a nice mosaic from the Church of the Multiplication that's in Tagba, and for some time before Bethsaida was excavated, they thought that Bethsaida was in Tagba. Now, we know that's not the case, but nonetheless, the tradition persists, and there's now a nice church there, and this mosaic is somewhat famous. Andrew is correct here. This is food that's barely enough for 1 or maybe 2 people. The fish are probably like dried sardines, so this is not a big meal. Barley was known as the peasant's bread because it was very, very much cheaper, and it just not as nourishing as wheat and all of that. So very, very meager supplies here that they would have had. And even if they had been close to a population center, which they really weren't, the largest towns in Galilee rarely had over 3,000 residents. So if they all went and tried to buy food for 5,000 plus people, then you can see that they would have quickly run out. Even if they had the money, they would have run out of the supply. This is, again, a parallel with Elisha, and we read about this in 2 Kings 4. Now a man came from Baal Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh grain in a sack. Elisha said, give them to the people that they may eat. But his attendant said, so we got, and that's, by the way, in the Septuagint, that's the same word used for the boy in our story in John chapter 6. How am I to serve this to 100 men? Nevertheless, Elisha said, give them to the people that they may eat, for this is what the Lord said, they shall eat and have some left over. So he served it to them, and they ate and had some left over, in accordance with the word of the Lord. So again, Jesus is recreating an Old Testament miracle. There's a belief that prophecy isn't just prediction and fulfillment. Prophecy is also pattern. So when you see something happening over and over again, it's further confirming that it is a work of God. Remember these leftovers, because they're going to come back and have a role to play in our story. Now, Jesus said, have the people recline to eat, and there was plenty of grass in the place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. So very interesting that we have this comment about grass. We wouldn't need to have it know that it's grass. They could have just sat anywhere. Mark actually adds one more detail in chapter 6, verse 39. He tells us the grass was green. And so that is another clue that tells us what time of year it is. The grass would have been green because of the rain that happens in the spring of the year right around the time of Passover. So you can see the area pictured above. It may not be the same area as the miracle, but it gives a good visual representation. It's probably not that far from wherever the crowds sat down to eat. And it's interesting, Jesus says, have the people recline, because that recalls the imagery of the messianic banquet. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So we're looking forward to this messianic feast where we will all be reclining at Jesus' table. Green grass also reminds us of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I will not be in need. He lets me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still or quiet water. So Jesus is the ultimate good shepherd here, even having the people who are about to be fed recline in green pastures. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were reclining. Likewise also the fish, as much as they wanted. Matthew, at least in the NASB, has something interesting. It says, and he looked up towards heaven, and he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave to the disciples. Now, you'll see that the food is in italics because it's not stated in the original. It just says, and he blessed. And I believe adding the food is likely an error by the translators because Jews for millennia, they've never blessed the food. They've blessed the one who gave them the food. As a messianic commentator writes, Yeshua no doubt chanted the motzi, which in Hebrew says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz. And that's translated as, Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And so this is the blessing before meals. They don't bless the food, they bless the one who gave them the food. And we see this also in Acts 27. Having said this is Paul talking about Paul. He took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. He broke it and began to eat. And I think many Christians, even without thinking, we bless the food. But I think let us get in the habit of blessing God who gives us the food. And we need to thank him for what he blesses us. If it's food that's worthy of being blessed, God has already done so. And I don't think everything we eat necessarily has God's blessing. So that's a topic for another day. But it's we always want to thank God for his provision and not worship a created thing instead of the creator. On a larger scale, though, Jesus is taking on the role as head of the household. Jesus is one who provides for all aspects of hospitality, even green grass as opposed to, crunchy grass or even dirt to have the people recline. Green grass is a little bit more comfortable. And then giving the blessing was something the head of the household did. All of this is a feast, a holy feast that stands in deliberate contrast to the drunken feast we studied last lesson of Herod Antipas. So we have this contrast happening as well. So just a lot going on in just a quick little passage here. And when they had eaten their fill, he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be lost. That's a very critical verse there. Jesus doesn't lose anything. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with pieces from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. So just like in the story about Elisha and the miracle of barley bread, we have leftovers as well. Lots of references to they will eat and be satisfied that Jesus could be alluding to here. Deuteronomy 8 is the blessing of the land, and it talks about I'm bringing you in and you will inherit a land of wheat and barley, vines, fig trees, and pomegranates, olive oil, honey, a land where you will eat food without shortage, in which you will not lack anything, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord God, for the good land which he has given you. And then also in Jeremiah, talking about the new covenant, my people will be satisfied with my goodness, declares the Lord. So the theme of eating and being satisfied instead of still being hungry. We will be fed and be satisfied in Jesus' kingdom. This basket here dates to about the time of Moses, and so it's interesting. We've got manna coming from heaven, and we've got leftovers here considerably more than what they started with. Now, the big difference there is the only time the Israelites could gather extra manna was in preparation for the Shabbat rest. Otherwise, the manna spoiled with worms. And so they were not to collect any extra because they relied on God for their provision. But here, the Messianic banquet could be viewed as a type of Shabbat dinner where there's going to be extra. We're going to recline at the table. And Jesus is also making sure that none are lost. So disciples are also shepherds. They're in charge of the flock. Only Mark records that they had leftover fish, whereas the other 3 Gospels just talk about they're focusing on the leftover bread. I think that's interesting. What could the 12 basketfuls mean? Certainly there's anyone's guess. It usually 12 is symbolic of all Israel. We have 12 tribes which one commentator believes the Gospel of John is written not to Jews in Judea, but it's written to Samaritans and other Israelite tribes, and that's why we have things such as the Passover of the Jews. And so he's being specific because there are lots of other Passovers being kept, but John is specifying the one of the Jews. 12 could also mean the 12 loaves of bread in the presence, bread of presence in the temple. And it's interesting that here we had 5 loaves that the miracle began with, and in the feeding of the 4,000 we had 7 loaves, and so we had a total of 12 loaves, possibly symbolizing that the 5,000 is 5 is often pictured as 5 books of Torah. So 5,000 would be the Jews are welcome to dine and recline, and then 4,000 is the next feeding, and that's a multiple of 4, which is always symbolic of the Gentile nations. So we have 4 corners of earth, 4 winds of heaven, 4 rivers flowing out of Eden to water the earth. And so in a sense, we have Jesus' provision for the Jews, and the feeding of the 4,000 is his provision for the Gentiles. Now, we have to hold all this loosely. It's possible that this had no symbolism at all because fish and bread were just staples of the diet in that day. Therefore, when people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet to come into the world." And note that it doesn't say a prophet, it says the prophet. On the basis of Deuteronomy 18, the people were expecting a prophet to arise like Moses. And if I combine verses 15 and 18, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you and from your countrymen. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them everything that I command him. So the Messiah was to be a second Moses. And with everything going on in this chapter, Jesus appears to fit that job description. So Moses was a deliverer. This must be our deliverer who's going to, overthrow the Romans, is what the people thought there. So Jesus, aware that they intended to come and take him by force, so whether Jesus agreed to it or not, they were going to do it to make him king, withdrew himself again to the mountain by himself alone. And so this is fascinating here. Historically, Galilee was a hotbed of revolutionary activity. In fact, the Great Jewish Revolt in the year 66 started in Galilee. And so just Antipas had very good reason to be wary of a crowd of this size gathering around a Messiah figure. And I think Jesus is aware of that. And, Jesus, in theory, now has an army of 5,000 who want to do, they're going to do whatever he says. And so it's interesting. Jesus doesn't confirm or deny that he is the prophet, but he definitely did not come for any messianic acclaim or to start a political revolution. In fact, he says, "I do not receive glory from people." And later he will say, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." So we've got, Herod Antipas's guards, even, they're probably spread out watching, Jesus' every move. And so, Jesus is not wanting any part of this right now because that is just not his mission right now. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started across the sea to Capernaum. And it had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So it appears that Jesus wanted to get back to Peter's house in Capernaum, which you can see in the distance here, without being detected. And depending on which version you read, either Jesus sends the crowd away, which would have been appropriate for a teacher to say, "Teaching, this is over, go home." But with the thought that they wanted to take him, it almost looks like Jesus had to take some evasive action. So he sends the disciples along, and he kind of is going to skirt away on his own and evade the crowd that way. But on the boat, the sea began getting rough because a strong wind was blowing. And then Matthew adds, the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves because the wind was contrary. And I always have to remind myself that these are experienced fishermen who knew these waters. And so their knowledge of how easily a boat could capsize, I think for us, has to underscore the danger of the situation. Now we're going to get there in a bit. We'll be there, and you won't believe that a lake this small can have storms this big, but it's actually true. So take a look at this picture here, which was from a storm in the early 20th century, it was hand colored, but look at the beating that this storm is causing here. We're not promised freedom from the storms, but I think like Noah, we're promised protection through the storms. And this reminds me of Matthew 7, verse 25, which we looked at on the Sermon on the Mount. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed and beat against that house, and it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. So the storms are going to come, but if we've got Jesus, then we're going to weather the storm okay. We're never promised freedom from the storms. We're not promised an easy life. Also, it reminds me of Noah. With storm waves increasing greatly upon the earth, we have the ark floating on the surface of the water, protected. Then when they had rowed about 25 or 30 stadia, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I," or literally in the Greek, he says, "I am," ego eimi, do not be afraid. So the Moses symbolism is continuing here. And of course, back in Exodus, Moses says, "Who shall I say sent me?" And God says, "Tell him I am sent you." Here's a photo which Dr. Bolin says is done without the assistance of Photoshop of a recreation of this event. So yet another time when Jesus tells his disciples not to fear. Mark adds a very curious comment in verse 48 of Mark chapter 6, and he says, "And he intended to pass by them." And perhaps this is another Moses reference, with Jesus playing the role of God passing by while Moses watches. Exodus 33, "If I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and show compassion to whom I will show compassion." Also, 1 Kings, he tells Elijah, "Go stand on the mountain before the Lord, and behold, the Lord was passing by." So we have a lot of symbolism here. So we have to remember that to the ancients, storms and water and wind and weather, they were very frightening to that society. But in contrast, the Bible begins with God demonstrating his authority over the waters. Genesis 1 verse 2, "The earth was formless and void, emptiness and darkness were over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water." So just like Jesus is walking on the water here, the Spirit of God was doing that in the beginning. Job 9 writes, "Who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea?" Of course, talking about God. Psalm 77, "The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you. They were in anguish. The ocean depths also trembled. Your way was in the sea, and your paths in the mighty waters, and your footprints were not known." And of course, the only place Jesus didn't leave footprints was right here when he walked on the water. We have Elijah and Elisha also split the Jordan and crossed through the middle of it. And then, of course, we have Moses parting the sea, and then Joshua parted the river, the Jordan River, and all that. But the Old Testament writes only one who trod upon the waters was God himself. And then in the New Testament, we have Jesus doing that thing even the greats of the Old Testament couldn't do. They had control over water, but none of them could walk on water except Jesus here. Peter responded and said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. And I always like to pause here. This is Peter desiring to be just like his rabbi. Remember Luke 6:40, "A student is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he has been fully trained, will be just like his teacher." And this is what Peter wanted to do. My teacher's walking on water, I want to walk on water. And so Peter responds to Jesus' "fear not" command with exceptional boldness. And again, just pause here. We know, most of us know the story. We know what's going to happen next. But remember, there's 11 other guys sitting in the boat that didn't get out, but Peter did. So let's give Peter some applause here for stepping out in faith. "But seeing the wind, he became frightened when he began to sink, and he cried out, saying, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out with his hand and took hold of him and said to him, 'You of little faith, why did you doubt?'" So stepping out in faith is not easy, and at times, just like Peter, we're going to fall. And I know Jesus says here to Peter, "Why did you doubt?" And that's probably what he says to us when we falter. But I also like to imagine the other 11 who are sitting safely in the boat getting just as convicted by these words. Why did you doubt? Why weren't they the ones? Why was Peter the only one to ask to step out in faith? So again, despite his weakness, Peter's faith surpassed the others. At least he got out of the boat. So remember, when the time comes, we need to get out of the boat. And that's the lesson I see here. Peter is again going to have a moment of triumph followed by a moment of failure in Matthew 16 at Caesarea Philippi, and we'll get to that one in due time. Psalm 69 talks about similar items of rescue. I have sunk in deep mud, there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me. I am weary with crying. My throat is parched. My eyes fail while I wait for my God. Isaiah 41, do not fear, I am with you, do not be afraid, I am your God, I will strengthen you, I will also help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Psalm 18, he sent me from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. So at times when we're going through trials, it can feel like we're drowning, but remember, all we have to do is reach out our hand, and Jesus is there to rescue us. Let's pick up a verse from Matthew here. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. So another miracle of calming the sea. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, you are truly God's son. And so this reminds me, during the first storm, they were afraid of him. Then they became very much afraid and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? But now here they say, and those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, you are truly God's son. So they're moving to a right posture of worship here. And this is our memory verse, Matthew 14, verse 33, the proclamation that you are truly God's son. It can be easily missed, but this is the first time that any human has acknowledged Jesus as God's son. The Father did, and the devil did, and at various points demons did. But this is the first time that any of his disciples or any other human says, you are truly God's son. Peter's going to echo this confession in Matthew 16 for his gold star moment at Caesarea Philippi, which we'll get to in a few lessons here. The sure cure for the Unitarian belief about Christ is to be out on a boisterous sea where no human power can help, and then see him come forth to quiet the boisterous waves and save the sinking soul. And that's Keith Brooks in a commentary that I read. Now back to John, they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat got to the land at which they were going. So another quick miracle here. Psalm 107, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He caused the storm to be still, so that the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they were quiet. So he guided them to their desired harbor. Now, in Jesus' economy, he just got them there quickly. So we've got 4 miracles here in quick succession. The walking on water, Peter walking on water briefly, Jesus calming the sea, and then the spatial displacement where they're immediately brought from the middle of the lake to the harbor there. So not just storms and sickness, but all kinds of physics, including distance, velocity, and time. They're all subject to his lordship. And so just a very powerful way to end this lesson with looking at Jesus' power. And also we began with his compassion. So he is this perfect mix of one who loves us and one who can do all things, and he is worthy of our worship and worthy of our saying, truly he is the Son of God. We'll pick up next time with Jesus' famous Bread of Life discourse, which will happen at the synagogue at Capernaum, and we'll catch you next time along the Talmidim way.